Hey everyone, it's Mike Shaw with Planit Pro, and in this video tutorial we're going to talk about the Neutral Density Filter feature, or ND filter feature for short. Now, as you know, the basic use of the ND filter is to extend your exposure time so you can create some special effects like blurring moving water or moving people in a crowd, for example. So to begin with, we're going to start right here in the exposure tool. And from here, you can then select different levels of the ND filter that you might require depending upon your scene. But before we jump in, let's go ahead and select the ND filter mode first by tapping just here. Now, this is a simplified version of the ND filter calculator, but it's very powerful. Let's go through what these numbers mean. First, the 200 number right here means 1/200th of a second shutter speed. So that's the shutter speed that you have before adding the ND filter. Now that you have that, you can select an ND filter by tapping right just here and say you can apply a one-stop ND filter. And now when you look at the second row, the shutter speed has been increased to 1/100th of a second, which is exactly a half of a 200-second shutter speed. Easy to understand. We'll call this increase in shutter speed in general the ND compensation throughout this tutorial, just to be clear. Let's see what happens when we try a 10-stop ND filter. Here we get an ND compensated shutter speed of 5 seconds. Now, the logic behind this goes something like this. 1/200th of a second increases to 1/100th of a second in one stop, to 1/50th of a second in two stops, to 1/25th of a second in three stops, to 1/12th of a second in four stops, a sixth of a second in five stops. Each time we're increasing the exposure time by a factor of 2, as you know. A third of a second in 6 stops, 2/3 of a second in 7 stops, 1.5 seconds in 8 stops, 3 seconds in 9 stops, and 6 seconds in 10 stops, which rounds out to be about 5 seconds. So we end up with 5 seconds with a 10-stop ND filter to give us the equivalent exposure as 1/200th of a second without any filters. Now, as a matter of fact, you can calculate these compensations in your head, but sometimes some of these ND effects with shutter speeds are harder to calculate than others. For example, a 30th of a second, which gives you an ND compensated shutter speed of 34 seconds, as you can see right here. So by using this utility, the ND filter tool, the ND compensation calculation becomes very easy. Now also, notice right over here that we've provided a really handy timer feature that you can use for long shutter speeds. So specifically for any shutter speed that's longer than 5 seconds, which you can set in the settings menu, you'll see a timer button right just here. So let's check out a demo, and we'll start by selecting an 8-stop ND filter. And what this does is, still at a 30th of a second shutter speed, this gives us a 9-second shutter speed as the correct ND compensation. Okay, so you can tap right here to start the timer, and you'll see a countdown notification display when the remaining time is 5 seconds, as you just saw, and you can then monitor that until the remaining time is up. And this will be useful when you're using the bulb mode on your camera, for example, and you don't have a timed remote handy. All right, so that's the basic version of the ND filter tool. So what else can we say about this calculator? Well, one of the limitations is that you can only really adjust the shutter speed, and sometimes you want to be able to adjust the aperture and the ISO in addition to the shutter speed in order to get the exact exposure that we want. So how do we do this? Easy. All we need to do is go back to the manual mode by tapping right up here. And yes, in fact, the manual mode tool can also be used for ND filter compensation calculations. And that's what I want to show you right now. So let me show you with this demonstration, but first we're going to return our ND filter compensation back to no filter, right just here. Okay, so generally speaking, when you want to calculate a correct ND compensation, in other words, you want to calculate the precise exposure settings with the ND filter, here's what you're going to want to do. First, for your scene, you're going to take a reference photo without the ND filter, and you're going to adjust your exposure settings to make sure that the peak of the histogram is ideally right in its center, meaning that you've obtained a correct exposure. If the peak is slightly off-center, it'll actually result in quite a significant difference after you apply the ND compensation calculation. And of course, depending on your scene, if you have more than one peak, just be sure the peak that corresponds to the main subject of interest is the one that you've centered in the center of the histogram. All right, so let's say for an example that you've done that and you've created a test photo, and that the exposure settings of that test photo are an ISO of 200, an aperture of f10 with a shutter speed of 1/200th of a second. And let's imagine that we also want to create exactly the same exposure, but with a much longer shutter speed, let's say around 30 seconds, for a really blurred motion effect instead of the 1/200th of a second. That's what we want to calculate right now. Okay, so now that we've got the actual exposure settings from the camera, all we need to do to begin with is to long press the EV button right here to make the EV parameter to be the one that's automatically calculated. And then we just copy in the camera settings like this right here into the tool. And what we see then is that the corresponding EV for this exposure is 13.3. Now, if you're saying to yourself, 13.3, what's that? Don't worry about it. It doesn't really matter right now. At least for these ND filter purposes, we don't really care what the actual numbers of the end of the EV mean exactly. But we've established what it is. So our next step is to tap on the filter button to add an ND filter. Now, before doing that though, we need to change the EV calculation from auto to a fixed value, in this case 13.3. And I understand this can be a little confusing, so don't be surprised if you decide to watch this next section a couple of times to make sure you understand what's going on. All right, so first, to make the EV fixed, all we need to do is just to make one of the three exposure settings the one that changes, or adjustable or automatic. And since we're playing around with the shutter speed, then that's the logical choice for the one to be calculated automatically. So to do that, we simply long press on the shutter speed tab just right here, and that's the one that's automatically adjusted after we add our ND filter. Good, okay. So now you just tap on the filter button to select the ND filter, and let's suppose that we want to choose 10 stops like we do right here. And what it tells us again is that a 5-second shutter speed is the correct ND compensation or ND compensated shutter speed. All right, so far it's still pretty straightforward. This is exactly the same result, in fact, that we got by using the ND filter mode. But let's see what we can do from here. So let's say for now that this 5 seconds is still too short for our situation. Remember, we want to have around a 30-second shutter speed is what we decided. And if we're in the ND filter calculation mode, and we're basically stuck, because the only way to get a longer exposure is to use a higher value ND filter. But what if the 10 stop is the only one that we have? But under the manual mode calculator that we have right here, we can also adjust the aperture, let's say to f25, to get a 32-second shutter speed like this. And that might be a really good shutter speed for our situation, as we were talking about. So in other words, we can combine the ND filter and the aperture to get the shutter speed we want. But we can also adjust the ISO. Let's suppose that we actually don't like f25, because that's kind of stopped down. And we want to use f16 instead, so we change it right just here. And now what we can do is we can adjust the ISO from 200 down to 100 to get 26 seconds. And that's pretty close to the 32 seconds that we calculated before. And that right there, that's the power of the manual mode. And for people who are familiar with photographic exposure, you'll recognize this feature, this notion, as photographic reciprocity. And in fact, we use the EV as kind of a middleman. If the EV is fixed, then we can get different exposure settings that will end up with the same EV based on the reciprocity principle. So to sum up, you can use the ND filter tool to easily calculate an ND filter compensated shutter speed, aperture, or ISO combination to give you exactly the exposure you need for whatever your scene requires, all by using the appropriate ND filter. So that's the end of the video tutorial. Go ahead and watch it a couple times and operate the tool in the app itself to really understand what's happening with it. But we guarantee once you understand what's going on, you're going to find this to be a super useful tool. So until next time, this is Mike Shaw with Planit Pro saying thanks for watching, and we hope you enjoy planning your ND shots with Planit.